Opening the center establishes immediate king safety and offers dynamic possibilities for piece development. Challenging white's central pawn from the flank, Sicilian defense instantly sparks asymmetry and dynamic counterplay. Quickly developing a knight to a central square controls key squares and prepares for pawn advances. Solidifying the center and opening a diagonal for the bishop, this establishes a robust Sicilian pawn structure that challenges white's early initiative. Unleashing the center pawn immediately escalates the pawn tension, forcing black to define their central structure. Breaking the center's tension immediately opens critical lines for piece activity. Opening the center now, white's knight boldly occupies the heart of the board, forcing immediate counterplay. Challenging white's central pawn grab, this knight development aims to free the queen's bishop and prepare for kingside castling. Developing the knight to c3 further solidifies central control, readying for future pawn advances or piece maneuvers. Developing this knight solidifies black's central presence and prepares for potential pawn breaks, setting the stage for a dynamic Sicilian defense battle. The bishop aggressively eyes the f7 square, a perennial weakness, and prepares to castle, aiming for rapid development and potential kingside pressure. Preparing to challenge white's central pawn and open lines for the bishop, this move simultaneously shores up the king's position by preparing to develop the bishop to a safer square, like e7, adding a layer of defensive solidity. Shifting the bishop to b3 strategically repositions the piece. Anticipating potential future pawn pushes from black like a6 and b5 by offering a clear escape square while maintaining pressure along the a2-g8 diagonal, a subtle but important defensive and offensive maneuver. Preparing castling is paramount, solidifying the king's safety and harmonizing the minor piece's development. Castling safely tucks the king away behind a pawn shield, a wise prophylactic measure before black potentially disrupts the center. Exchanging that knight on d4 instantly simplifies the pawn structure, relinquishing central control and opening the d-file for potential future action, while also inviting a subtle shift in positional advantage. Reclaiming the pawn with the queen immediately stabilizes white's center and prepares to develop remaining pieces, while the knight on d4, now supported, exerts significant influence. Finally, black's king finds shelter, a vital step in consolidating after the queen's sortie, hinting at a desire to connect rooks and prepare for central maneuvering rather than immediate confrontation. Launching a pawn storm on the kingside immediately, white aims to shatter black's defensive pawn structure and open lines towards the uncastled enemy king, creating an aggressive, dynamic battlefield. Preparing to contest the queenside space and potentially challenge white's bishop on b3, this pawn advance also shores up the c5 square and aims for a more dynamic pawn structure, setting the stage for potential queenside expansion or a transition to a more active middle game. Guarding the king's retreat, this seemingly passive repositioning creates a crucial escape square and prepares the eventual deployment of the queen to a more active diagonal, hinting at a potential kingside attack as white consolidates their central space. Initiating a playful pin against white's queen, the bishop aggressively eyes the d3 square, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development and potentially exploit the queen's current prominence. Unleashing the rook from its defensive post aims to activate it along the f-file, potentially pressuring black's kingside, while simultaneously preparing for a later pawn push on the kingside or central expansion, creating a dynamic imbalance in white's setup. Boldly seizing the central initiative, this move tears open the pawn structure, creating immediate tactical possibilities and forcing white to confront the raised stakes in the heart of the board. Striking at the pawn chain creates an immediate tension, forcing black to decide on the structure of the ensuing middle game, potentially unlocking lines for your rook on the f-file. Black's bishop embarks on a daring diagonal descent, immediately challenging the queen and injecting a burst of tactical complexity into the center. Unleashing the queen to a4 forces black to confront an immediate dilemma, either reinforcing the endangered knight or sacrificing material for king's safety. The bishop strategically retreats, avoiding immediate capture and maintaining influence over the central squares, while also preparing to contest the open d-file by potentially redeploying to c6 later if the opportunity arises. Aimed squarely at disrupting black's queen and bishop battery, this bishop deployment forces a decision, potentially gaining time while preparing to exploit the central weakness created by black's pawn advance. A bold bid for central space. By recapturing the pawn, black immediately challenges the dominance white has been trying to build on the d-file. This opens up lines for black's pieces, potentially creating counterplay and putting pressure on white's kingside. It's a dynamic decision that injects immediate tension into the position, shifting the focus from white's slow development to an active confrontation in the center. This move signals black's intent to break free from passive defense and seize the initiative. Unlocking the d-file for attacking prospects, this bishop repositions to a square that simultaneously defends the knight and prepares to support a potential pawn push down the center. Reclaiming the central tension by reinforcing the e-file is a logical repositioning, preparing to contest white's active queen and potentially disrupt their pawn structure after a future d4 push. Reclaiming the central d-file with the rook immediately creates a dynamic tension, aiming to dislodge black's advanced bishop and potentially force concessions on the queen side. Suddenly, the knight lunges towards white's kingside, a bold infiltration aiming to exploit any slight misstep and initiate a dangerous skirmish around the monarch. Challenging the knight's aggressive forward placement is the immediate strategic goal, forcing a decision regarding its future. Unleashing a bold foray, the queen surges forward, directly challenging the king's sanctuary and disrupting the nascent harmony of white's pieces. This aggressive posture injects immediate tactical urgency, forcing white to reevaluate defensive priorities and potentially exposing weaknesses in their pawn shield. It's a calculated risk, aiming to exploit white's seemingly passive rook on f3 and create immediate disarray. The rook's repositioning to the f-file aims to solidify control over this crucial open avenue, potentially supporting a future pawn push or creating attacking chances against black's castled king. White is clearly building pressure, orchestrating a slow, deliberate buildup rather than seeking immediate fireworks, suggesting a strategic intent to exploit any positional weaknesses black might inadvertently reveal. This maneuver also anticipates black's potential desire to utilize their own rook on the e-file, creating a dynamic where the fate of these central files becomes paramount. Exchanges on the d4 square offer a crucial decision point. By taking with the bishop, black initiates a simplification that aims to dislodge white's advanced pieces and potentially expose the king's haven. Reclaiming the queen after the exchange instantly reestablishes white's central presence and aims to exploit the exposed black king, which might feel a bit cramped with its own pieces, hindering its escape routes. Opening a diagonal for the bishop and reinforcing the central pawn structure, this maneuver aims to pressure white's queen side and potentially disrupt their pawn formation while preparing for a more active rook presence. The knight repositions, aiming to exploit the newly opened diagonal and potentially create a strong outpost on d5, a square previously contested. This maneuver forces black to confront the immediate threat and consider the long-term implications of white's central control. A dramatic unraveling of the center is initiated as black accepts the exchange, hoping to simplify into a potentially favorable rook and pawn structure after the dust settles from this forced sequence. Unleashing the bishop from its guarded square now aims to exploit the lingering weakness on the dark squares surrounding black's king, subtly preparing for a potential kingside advance or a strategic repositioning to threaten the enemy monarch directly. Sensing the potential for a kingside attack after white's h-pawn advance, black wisely repositions their knight to a more active square, preparing to support a potential pawn break or even a tactical infiltration. Securing the queenside pawn majority becomes paramount now, establishing a solid foundation for future operations and restricting black's maneuvering space on that flank. Black's knight on g4, while creating some initial mischief, is now somewhat misplaced and needs reevaluation. But this particular placement on d7 aims to fortify the kingside defenses and potentially redeploy the knight to a more active square later, perhaps via e5 if circumstances allow. while also offering a slight reprieve for the queen from its exposed central position. Reactivating the rook to the e-file injects life into white's position, preparing to contest the open file and potentially target black's king, which currently lacks robust pawn protection on the king side. With the rook now anchoring the d-file, black initiates a subtle yet potent restructuring, aiming to redeploy forces and contest control of crucial open lines. Unleashing the queen to e5 aims to disrupt black's already precarious central position and probe for weaknesses around the king. This maneuver seeks to exploit the open d-file that white has managed to secure, hinting at future infiltration. It also frees up the rook on f3, potentially allowing it to participate more actively in the queen side or even reroute to support an attack. White is clearly looking to inject some immediate dynamism into the position, forcing black to react and potentially make concessions. Securing the king's escape route, this move proactively prepares for potential future queen incursions and aims to destabilize white's imposing central pawn structure by hinting at pawn advances like g5. The bishop gracefully retreats, preparing to join the central skirmish and reinforce the knight's presence, eyeing the weakened d5 square and aiming to disrupt black's coordinated pieces. This maneuver aggressively targets the d2 square, creating a delightful bind on white's queen side and challenging white's central structure with a bold rook infiltration. Stepping forward with b4 aims to disrupt black's entrenched pawn structure on the queen side, potentially creating opportunities for expansion and forcing awkward piece placements, though it does leave the queen side slightly more exposed to future incursions. Unleashing a rook to the second rank opens a potent tactical can of worms, directly threatening the white queen and potentially creating a mating attack if white isn't careful with their king's safety. Repositioning the rook to its initial rank seeks to untangle white's pieces, particularly the f3 rook, and prepares for potential pawn advancements on the queen side, aiming to break black's queenside blockade. Sacrificing the rook opens a critical file, forcing a king walk and potentially creating a passed pawn on the queen side. The rook recaptures, immediately contesting the now open d-file, aiming to exploit the potential weakness around black's king while simultaneously defending the pinned knight. The rook now finds a more active outpost on the third rank, eyeing potential breakthroughs and disrupting white's king's safety by leveraging the open file. Finally, the queen's decisive foray into the enemy's back rank, exchanging for the rook, aims to simplify into a winning material advantage. Swapping off the queen, a bold but perhaps desperate attempt to simplify the position, now black faces an immediate endgame where their remaining knight holds the sole hope for counterplay against a looming pawn's majority. Capturing that knight on e8 forces the black king into an exposed position, setting up a swift material advantage through the discovered attack on the rook. The black king, now exposed, seeks refuge on the seventh rank, hoping to find a sliver of safety behind its pawns. Opening the pathway for the queen to rejoin the fray significantly alters the pawn structure, creating immediate pressure on black's weakened queen side. Unleashing the queen to eye the pawn on c5 aims to disrupt white's queenside expansion and potentially create counterplay, though it exposes the queen to immediate threats and might miss a chance to consolidate defenses. Reasserting control over the central files, this redeployment clears the way for potential pawn advances and prepares to contest the now open e-file, aiming to neutralize black's surprisingly active rook. Opening the queenside pawn structure, this maneuver injects life into the isolated queenside pawns, potentially creating past threats or activating previously passive pieces, while simultaneously weakening the king's immediate pawn shield and creating exploitable weaknesses that white's rooks will eagerly target. Clearing a central pathway for the rook to infiltrate the opposing position, this capture unlocks the pawn's potential to advance and contest the queenside's structural integrity. The queen immediately seeks active squares, aiming to pressure the weakened light squares around white's king and potentially fork the rook and knight if white isn't careful with their development. Restoring the rook to its post after the dramatic queen sacrifice is a pragmatic step, aiming to consolidate white's material advantage and prepare for a quiet endgame transition where the extra pawn on the queen side might prove decisive. Seizing the exposed pawn on a 2 presents a tempting tactical opportunity, yet overlooks the precariousness of your king's position and the immediate threat of white's rook establishing dominance on the open f-file. Pawns advance to secure the queenside advantage, aiming to restrict black's maneuvering space and potentially create a passed pawn. The queen's venture to the 5th rank, while appearing active, leaves it somewhat exposed and disconnected from the defense of the remaining pawns, potentially inviting further advances from white's passed pawn. Re-establishing control over the central files is paramount after black's queen's excursion. The rook's relocation aims to challenge black's pawn majority on the queen side and potentially reroute for defensive duties. A timely consolidation of the queen's position, anchoring it behind the pawn chain and preparing to contest the crucial central files, while simultaneously offering a slight sidestep from the immediate, potentially hazardous open lines. Reclaiming the central file with the rook now opens up possibilities to pressure black's queen and potentially coordinate with the other rook for an onslaught on the queenside pawns. Unleashing the king's side pawn storm now risks fatally weakening the monarch's shelter, especially with the open G file poised for intrusion. Seizing the open file, white initiates a critical pawn sacrifice to break open black's kingside, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure and create immediate tactical possibilities. The black king, now exposed on the 6th rank, attempts to find some breathing room amidst the dangerous open files and white's attacking cavalry. Opening the G-file dramatically reshapes the battlefield, aiming to exploit the exposed black monarch and create immediate threats. A desperate bid to untangle the king from the exposed central files, though it comes at the steep price of further isolating the lone pawn on the queen side. The king's safety is paramount. This check forces a defensive reaction, potentially disrupting black's pawn structure and opening lines for white's rooks. The king, now exposed on the kingside, must find sanctuary amidst this aggressive onslaught, a desperate attempt to regroup and defend against the impending onslaught. Initiating a patient regrouping maneuver, the rook repositions to a more central square, preparing to support potential pawn advances and exert pressure on the open files that are beginning to emerge. King's safety suddenly becomes paramount as black's monarch is exposed on the kingside, directly facing a strong rook on the 7th rank. Hoping to corner the black queen and gain breathing room, the rook now probes from the flank, aiming to exploit the open files.